the back way.
Let's call a meeting to order, the City of Oak Harbor's Planning Commission, regular meeting, March 28, 2017. Let the record show that all are present except Commissioner Mann. The first item on the agenda this evening is the approval of the February 28, 2017 regular business meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
I move that we accept the meeting minutes from the February 28, 2017 meeting.
Second. Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? It's been approved. The next item, as we do at every meeting, is soliciting public comment. The Planning Commission will accept items that are not otherwise on the agenda for the first 15 minutes of the Planning Commission meeting. We have one person, and she, I believe, is going to be here just about the item that's on the agenda, correct? Okay. So seeing no others, I'll close that part of our meeting. Next up is the public meeting. I'm going to call on Commissioner Cac Kamak, Senior Planner, excuse me. I gave you another title tonight. I'm sure you don't want to be the commissioner, however. Variances for oak tree protection.
Thank you. Good evening, Cac Kamak Senior Planner. Here to just start a discussion about a code amendment related to variances for oak trees. Before I start, the one thing I did realize that I did not include in my report and in your packet is the actual code that we think needs to be amended. So, here are copies of you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me make a quick reference to the handout that I just handed to the commission. The section we're looking at is 1966-040. It's on the second page, and we're looking at one, setbacks. And it says here, a variance may be granted to allow intrusion of a building into a setback yard by 10 feet to preserve an oak tree located elsewhere on the property. In no event shall a setback be less than 5 feet to a side yard or 10 feet to an adjacent public street be approved. So that is the language that we're hoping to address in my discussion. And so I didn't include a copy, my apologies, but that's the section we're looking at. So in order to try and kind of dive into this a little bit, I thought maybe some history would be helpful here. So I have a real short presentation. We all know that the Gary oak tree is a very important tree to Oak Harbor. It's the tree that gives the town its name, and so back in 1991, the city adopted an ordinance specifically protecting oak trees, and that was Ordinance 898, and a copy of that ordinance is attached to your report. So what that, I think a consultant was hired, if I'm told right, that to come up with these regulations. They had public meetings, and they came up with those comprehensive set of regulations to protect the Gary oak. So in 2005, the city was doing a critical area ordinance update. During that time, I think there were discussions to move the Gary oaks into the critical area ordinance and make it into a critical area. I can see how that discussion would have gone. I wasn't here during that time, but I can see how that fits into a critical area, because it is kind of an environmentally sensitive species. We have to protect its environment. It fits in with other environmental regulations. And so therefore, it was shifted under the critical area ordinance, and there was a lot of regulations already written under the critical area section to regulate critical areas. So I can see how during that change in 2005, they decided to put sections of this 898 into various sections of the code and allow the code to, existing language in the code to regulate some of the things that were already written. So once it became a critical area, we have a section in the critical area ordinance that talks about how to change critical areas, how to amend them, and how to get a variance, how to use the property. Example, wetlands. If you had wetlands on your property, there are rules written on how you can still develop your property even if you have wetlands, and there are some flexibility that's given so that you can still have the right to develop your property. So similar to that, Gary Oaks will also be a critical area, and all those regulations that provide flexibility to a wetland also applies to a Gary Oak. So they kind of shifted Gary Oak under the environmental section, and I provided the section, oak tree protection section, for you in the code as well, in terms of what language it has right now. That's section 2016, that ordinance 1441, that which is attachment 2, is what was adopted. And you can see in that language, it talks about, what you shouldn't do to an oak tree, what to do if you want to trim it, you have to get a permit, and variances and so on for that. Well, one of the things that, there was some language in 898 regarding development of lots, single-family lots, and Gary Oaks on them. And there was some variance language in that code that says, okay, if you have an oak tree on your property, then there is some flexibility to it. And since it's a development code, I can see how the planners and the planning commissioners at that time thought it was okay to put that under the zoning code, because that's where we deal with development of property, and we deal with variances. And so that language regarding setbacks got put into 1966, which is what we're looking at right now, to see how we can do variances for oak trees. Now, I'm going to point out a couple things in the code that will provide us the history. So the discussion for today, the original ordinance 898 had language in section 5.3b, which is what I wanted to point out. So if I can take your attention to the 898 ordinance that's in your report. If you look at section 5 and subsection 3 underneath it, it says application to various zones and uses. And subsection B underneath that is a language that changed, I think, from historical purposes into what we see in 1966 today. So it says, no permit for removal, topping, or trimming of an oak tree shall be required for any lot when the oak tree is located in an area outside of a set backyard. So what that basically means is, if you had an oak tree on your property, and if it was on the side along the property line, it was within the setbacks of your normal house, 5 feet on one side, 12 feet, 20 feet in the back, 20 feet in front. If an oak tree was there, then you can't remove that oak tree. You had to accommodate it in your plans. But if the oak tree was not in the setback and it sat somewhere in the middle of your property, this language says that you can basically take it down and build a house. No permit required. You want to build a house, it's sitting in the center of your lot, take it down. I think when they transferred 898 to the critical area ordinance and transferred it into the variance section, there must have been some discussion saying that doesn't seem right to be able to take this oak tree down. So let's give some flexibility. Let's move the house around a little bit. And so this current language, I think, came from that. Is like allowing the house to move within the setbacks. But I think the fear at that time, when you make a change, anytime you make changes in zoning ordinance, we always want to err on the kind of less restrictive or more restrictive side. We didn't want the houses being pushed all the way to the front at that time. You know, we're talking 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So they put the limitation saying, okay, you can push the house, but you can't push it farther than 5 feet or farther than 10 feet. And that's the language that we see in our code today. But we haven't had an instance since they changed the code to today's limitations for that setback. We haven't had an application that came in and said, can I get a variance? So for many years, this code has been sitting in our ordinance, never tested. Now we have an application. We have a Gary Oak on a property along Rose Hill Development, Melrose Place, that sits somewhat squarely, I won't say center, but somewhat in the property in such a way that it does impact where the house could be. And in working with the owners of the property, they are willing to make adjustments to protect this oak tree and move the building and the house closer to the side yard and the front yard. But this limitation saying you can't get closer than 5 feet or 10 feet to the front yard is preventing them from moving that structure and keeping that oak tree. So as staff, we're looking at it going, okay, you know, if you're going to protect the oak trees, why have this limitation? Today's, you know, those setbacks primarily came from, you know, when zoning was first done in 1910, when New York City, when, you know, buildings were built really close to each other, there was no light, air, there's just public safety issues. Setbacks were created from that era. They were transferred over the years into different developments, and for fire code reasons, you'd separate buildings. But building codes have gotten better, building materials have gotten better, and there are ways to do construction nowadays where you can do them without setbacks. So in protecting this oak tree, now we're asking the question, are these setbacks really essential to have as a limitation? Can we adjust the building? Can we provide the maximum flexibility? Because we think oak trees are important, we want to preserve them, and we want to give the maximum flexibility to a landowner to move their building. Why have these limitations? So that's kind of where this idea for this text amendment comes from. So that's what we thought we'll discuss with the Planning Commission. So that's the general basis for why we're bringing this up. So we're considering to bring forward a text amendment to try and eliminate that limitation and provide the flexibility. When you're providing a variance, why not look at it property by property? If they can fit a building within the setbacks, we wouldn't want to vary it, right? We would accommodate it. If we're going to vary it and if we're going to push the building to the setbacks, should there be a limit? In today's world, we think it doesn't have to be. We can make some other adjustments, and it's done lot by lot basis. It's not going to happen very often, and things can be worked out. So we think that the limitation was placed in there. It didn't come from 898. It just came from a discussion in 2005, those limitations. And I think we can change that moving forward. So that is kind of the text amendment we're asking the Planning Commission to consider. So we just wanted to bring that, give you the information, and get your feedback on what you think of it, and if you're open to something like that as a text amendment. So any questions?
So if you're not going to remove the setbacks as they sit, but you're going to add like another paragraph saying if you're unable to meet these setbacks, then a variance would be provided on a case-by-case basis?
What we would probably do, and I'll bring back some text language. I don't have any draft language. I'm just kind of floating the idea right now. But we would take away the last sentence under 1960, the handout that I just gave you, 1966-040, under that one setbacks, we changed that language to say that variance may be granted to allow intrusion of a building into a setback yard, and just leave it at that, and not have any minimum, any minimum dimensions that they need to stay away from.
So, in that case, you know, you're talking about the Rose Hill neighborhood. All those properties currently sit basically one car length back from the street. The driveway on all those properties is that big, not any bigger. And there's potential that then one of those properties would be brought out maybe all the way up to the street or to the sidewalk level?
Potentially, the current drawings indicate, I think, it's a curve, the street curves.
Right.
So they bring the house a little forward. I think where it straightens out, it's kind of back 10 or 12 feet, but where it curves, it's the corner of the building gets closer than 10 feet. I think it's close to 7 feet or something like that. So, but it is pretty close to the street, yes.
I'm just wondering, are you changing the composition of the neighborhood if you're gonna allow case-by-case variances where a house is suddenly considerably closer to the street than any of the neighbors?
Potentially, yes, and variances do that, and that's where the balance lies in granting a variance. And that's where the debate lies, and in the decision to whether grant the variance. What are you upholding? Are you upholding the aesthetic value of your street configuration, or are you upholding the Gary Oak? I mean, there's always a pro and con there, which is what you're weighing when you're considering a variance.
So, you know, obviously the Gary Oaks are a public interest here. Is this just an administrative decision where the public wouldn't weigh in on the case-by-case basis?
Oh, no. Variances are public hearings.
Okay.
Hearing examiner is the person that hears it, so it's like a quasi-judicial hearing, and you gotta meet criteria in order to justify it. So, yes, public hearing, notification to surrounding property owners, all of that.
Okay, thank you.
In driving around the older part of Oak Harbor, which is where the larger trees are at, what I've seen is, some much older homes, a lot of character, and a lot of the Gary Oaks are in the front yard and in the backyards. In some cases, several in the backyards. And if we start down this pathway and those homes change hands and they rebuild, are we looking at doing this a lot in the future? Based on
Potentially,
the size of the trees, I mean, that's what I see as some very stately trees that occupy the majority of the backyard.
absolutely. It's hard to say how much redevelopment will happen in an older section of town. We usually see it case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
They're remodeling over the existing footprint. Very rarely do we have a total tear down and a rebuild. So I'm not sure if it will happen more often or if it'll happen on very intermittently. It's hard to predict. But that's where we'll see most of the variance requests, where the Gary Oaks are, and that's in the older part of town. And a case can always be made for the older parts of town as a unique character to the town, and therefore it changes based on the environment. So we're not expecting a whole lot of applications, like I said, since we've adopted this language in 2005. This is the first application, and this is a new lot, new development. We haven't gotten any variance from an existing lot in the time that I've been here,
Well, I
or
just
since
always-
the adoption of the ordinance.
I always look, I'm very familiar with redevelopment areas, okay? And the oldest areas of any city will always predominantly be the redevelopment area. And those locations where the majority of the stately Gary Oaks are at are in the oldest part of the neighborhood, and generations change, properties change hands, and things happen. And I just don't want to go down that path where we're starting, like 7 feet is from the corner of a house to the sidewalk is pretty close, to where it just starts changing the whole dynamics of the neighborhood. Because they're wanting to build a bigger house on the property, is that, I'm assuming that's what, and we're not addressing that issue, but the footprint of the house is what's dictating the setback area, correct?
The current application we have, it's a long history, but they ended up with really small lots in a new subdivision. So it's not the size of, I mean, they're making adjustments. The size of the house is not extraordinarily big in making their request. They are trying to accommodate the minimum house they can on the lot. That's a very specific circumstance in which they're doing. If they have a big lot and they want to build a big house and they're wanting to take an oak tree down, let's say, or move it elsewhere, I think, again, you have to look at it on a case-by-case. That's the beauty of a variance, is it's a case-by-case basis. Just because somebody was granted a variance in one part of town for an oak tree, it's not guaranteed through the variance process that you will get it on another part of town. That's why the variance process is a judicial process, and you have to meet the criteria in order to qualify for that variance. So it's not standard that every property that has an oak tree is a candidate for variance. That's not necessarily true.
So what you're saying is you're primarily looking at just a setback, a variance may be granted to allow intrusion of a building into the setback yard.
Yeah.
And
Because any other variance actually doesn't have limitations, in the sense, like if you had, for example, a disabled person that moves into a house and they don't have, usually those are what variances are for, they don't have an access ramp. And the ramp has to infringe into the setbacks because of the size of the property. They have to make it so big or so long that it has to do that. There's no limitation there that you still have to stay back any distance. You look at the property and you look at the conditions and you look at the proposal and you go, okay, this is what fits on this lot, therefore your variance is granted. So you're not assessing against any minimums at that point, and we're hoping that that's what will happen in every case-by-case scenario here. The variance will be granted to the minimum that's necessary, not the maximum, if that makes sense.
thank you.
Any discussion? Questions?
So I would encourage taking public comments. This is just a public meeting, it's a discussion, informal discussion, so I would encourage taking public comments. What we're hoping to do is schedule a hearing and get a draft in front of the commission, and then we'll have a chance to talk more about this as we move forward.
Do I have any takers on public comment?
For the record, again, I'm Laura Benninger with the Oak Harbor Gary Oak Society. Our group is pleased to hear that the city wants to take this approach. It's always good when a homeowner will do everything they can to protect a tree. We have to remember the trees were here, the mature ones we're talking about, well before we were. So this is encouraging, I think. The history of the Melrose property is, as Cac said, very complicated. And so I think anything we can do to work in partnership with the builder to preserve the integrity of the tree is a good thing for the community. The trees really are an asset. They're, as Cac said, the namesake of Oak Harbor. And we really haven't been able to replace all the trees that we lost in the last century. And so the mature trees that we have now are extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Any other comments from the commissioners? Okay. Well, then, I guess I'll announce that our next meeting will be on April 25, 2017. And I'll call this meeting adjourned.